Welcome to the Need to Know podcast, the world's leading podcast on dual-use technology and pressing topics in national security across AUKUS, NATO, and beyond. In this episode, BOKA CEO John James and operating partner Teresa Smetzer sat down with Ellen McCarthy, Chairwoman and CEO of the Truth in Media Cooperative and Noodle Labs, as well as former Assistant Secretary of State for the Bureau of Intelligence and Research. In this episode, we'll discuss how accelerated development and adoption of emerging technologies can be critical, including AI, quantum computing, and advanced manufacturing. We'll discuss how private capital can bolster AUKUS alliances, drive rapid advancements in critical technologies, and enable governments to address strategic needs in real time.
I'm John James, and I'm the CEO of BOKA Group, and I'm joined by my colleague, Teresa Smetzer.
Teresa Smetzer, I'm an operating partner at BOKA Group, and I'm a retired CIA executive.
My name is Ellen McCarthy. I'm the CEO of the Trust in Media Cooperative and a retired intelligence analyst officer.
Great. Thank you so much, Ellen, for agreeing to be on this edition of BOKA Capital's podcast. We greatly appreciate it. We know how busy you are, so thank you. Your career has spanned many facets of national security and intelligence, starting with your role as a technical submarine analyst with the Office of Naval Intelligence, Coast Guard, USDI, president of the Intelligence and National Security Alliance, part of the executive team at the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, then leading as president of an operating group of Nobles, and then being nominated and confirmed as the Assistant Secretary of State for Intelligence and Research, and now, of course, your role as founder and CEO of TIM, or Trust in Media. It's hard to even imagine somebody with a broader background in across the DC scene when it comes to national security. So it'd be interesting to get your point of view or perspective on how things have those experiences have shaped your point of view on national security, and what do you feel is the most important aspect of strengthening national security today?
Teresa, you walked down memory lane, and by the way, you were there through many of those experiences. So I'm grateful for that, and I just feel old, especially today. Having been up all night long, essentially watching the election. I'll tell you, as you go through all these experiences, the one experience that I really highlight whenever I'm asked this question really is my first briefing I ever gave at what was then the Navy Technical Intelligence Center. And just a quick vignette, I was briefing a Navy captain who was really interested in going out and collecting some information. And it was my job as the brand new analyst in the shop to tell this captain that we didn't need this information. We already had it. Like, it was not necessary for him to do this. And so I went and presented him a briefing on everything I knew. It was on a Whiskey class Soviet submarine, a diesel submarine, and it was my job to tell him everything. And I did. I knew the waste disposal system on that submarine. I knew everything about it. And when I briefed him, I had a slide that had my name and Whiskey Class SS. It was all uppercase. And before I even started, he asked me, "Do you normally spell your name with all the C's in your name with all capitals?" And I said, "No, it's normally a lowercase c and an uppercase C in McCarthy." And his response to me is, "Well, why in the hell should I listen to the rest of this briefing if you can't even spell your name?" And the reason I share this story is because it was such a great first story, in that I really learned that, our job as intelligence analysts and people in the intelligence community is to provide others with information that can help them. And no matter whether you like them or not, no matter whether you agree with what they're doing or not, but that's your job. And so I learned very on about the importance of actually getting to people, delivering information in a way that they can provide value, understanding how important it is to actually create relationships and partnerships. It was a lesson that would serve me through the rest of my career. But the thing that really strikes me is how, that was the Cold War. So when intelligence was kind of the only game in town in terms of, data that was collected through either intel operators on the ground or through satellite systems. It was usually through national technical means. the brightest analysts in the country, pulling these insights together and delivering intelligence. And for the most part, it was highly classified because it was all about protecting this information. And how much things have changed since then. Now where we live in a world where data is immense, is vast, and getting vaster with the introduction of generative AI. And the tools to go through that data and come up with analysis are just so amazing. And now insights that used to only be able to be derived through classified systems, protected, now can actually be gotten very easily in the open. And, so that really puts the intelligence community in a very interesting position right now. And because we still operate under the same premise that we did during the Cold War, or actually we did during post-World War II, our ability to bring in some of these tools and capabilities is really stunted. And, I think the IC needs to be much more adroit at leveraging these tools and insights than they are right now. Actually, the whole national security sector does. So I guess this is a long way of saying that, I think, the national security sector really needs to put more focus on how it works with the private sector. And I know we're going to talk a little bit more about that.
So just a quick follow-on to that point, which was great. How do you view the allies as participating in that sort of engagement?
Again, in a world that's getting more complex, more interconnected, where, our challenges, our national security challenges cross borders, the reality is that our relationships with our allies is more important than ever. It's also our secret sauce. The reality is that that's what makes the U.S. who the U.S. is, and all of our allies who they are. It is these relationships. And so while we have incredibly close relationships and have, since the end of World War II, or since World War II, they're going to become even more important. And we're going to have to expand those relationships beyond sort of the traditional ones, NATO, EU, because the world is just it's becoming a very small place where we require friends from all over.
So can I ask on that? I mean, obviously, amongst the allied countries, so in sort of the tightest sense, you've got AUKUS and then NATO and other sort of bilateral relationships, but different allies have different sort of additive factors where it comes to technology. So there's different elements of research. There's different elements that are combined as one with the US provide a sort of next level. So what I'm trying to work out is what you see as maybe some of the biggest opportunities for the US and allies in leveraging tech, given the nature of some of today's threats.
Well, it's interesting from my time at State Department, I really understood the value of our partnerships from an intelligence sharing perspective, the ability to gain insights and to have a better understanding, better situational awareness of areas of the world that we just didn't have, we didn't have as much insights to, and how amazingly important that was. And I think that analogy very much applies to the technology sector, where where one country can't be great at everything. We may. So you look at Germany, for example, and some of their manufacturing capabilities. The whole is always the sum of its parts, and so it's about bringing in those parts who bring in unique capabilities and then working together. And so much like we have worked intelligence sharing relationships, we very much need to continue to enhance those relationships in the private sector as it relates to R&D and to sharing of technologies and to really focusing on problems together. And I think we've got a great start at that, but we certainly have a long way to go as we look at China and India and other areas of the world.
I mean, it looks to me like you've got a bunch of adversaries who are spending in large amounts in certain technologies. And the US has an opportunity with its allies to spread that cost and that risk across them. So you might have, for example, Australia might focus on quantum compute, for example, or you might have the UK focused on some sort of advanced manufacturing for missile defense or whatever else it might be. But all of that is additive to the greater cause. Then it means the US doesn't have to focus on those areas. It can obviously spread its capital into other areas as well. So, I mean, from my perspective, it just seems that we've got more of an opportunity to maximize the benefits of those those technologies, if we can spread them across those nations.
Well, and to add to that, John, I think it's also the global kind of relationship. Obviously, Australia has some advantages being physically in Asia that are beneficial to the US or to the West more generally. The UK has a better point of view when it comes to Europe and the Middle East just because of their proximity, right? So it's both tech, but it's also the geospatial positioning of these countries where we can't be everywhere. So how do we leverage that more effectively? And I think your State Department experience certainly showed that. But what are your thoughts on how we can do more in that regard?
Well, I think that's Teresa. To your point, it's a good news story is that I think more sort of companies that are really focusing on the importance of understanding what's going on in the geopolitical landscape. I've certainly seen that over the last 5 years than almost ever before. Heck, since leaving government, I've been called in to brief companies to talk about sort of what's going on in the world, because these companies are very need to be aware of everything from where they make investments to physical security of their own systems. And so, I mean, that's kind of a good news story, is that there's more awareness, even since COVID with supply chain, that it's much more important. We need to understand what's going on in the world. And so, we need to continue to invest in capabilities that provide that level of understanding. So, I look at the US government, for example, and, the role of public-private partnerships has always been critically important, but I think it's becoming even more critically important looking into the future. Sharing of information back and forth, so things like, CISA, the Department of Homeland Security, has centers where companies and the government share cyber information. And, it's just critically important that there's more back and forth. I think the U.S. needs to do a better job of sharing with companies classified information so they understand what's going on. And again, it really is anything we can do to enhance communications and information sharing between the public and private sector, I think is even more important now than it even was 10 years ago.
Well, a lot of what you're talking about really is this risk management rubric that's different, right? It can't be all about security. It's got to be looking at more of a cost-benefit analysis, and we've got to be more aggressive in engaging and sharing and trusting with the appropriate measures to protect information that truly is unique. And so that's part of what comes to mind when I listen to you talk, is how do we think about a different risk management approach?
Well, that's what we could spend an hour just talking about that. I kind of hinted at that with my opening, that you've got all this incredible data and tools and capabilities that are going in the private sector, and you still have a procurement and an acquisition process that is rooted very much in the Cold War. And so how does the government actually engage with the private sector, incorporate these capabilities, communicate with the private sector about what they're seeing and what they're needing in this environment? And that kind of gets to sort of the topic of this podcast, which is that, I think this is where private equity, venture capital plays a huge role in sort of helping bridge that gap right now in terms of, encouraging investments in capabilities and also then on the risk side, taking on more of the risk so that by the time there is something that the government can finally incorporate into its architecture, it's ready. But I hope as we start a new day looking at a new administration that, there certainly is more discussion. We've talked about this for 20 years about the procurement acquisition process and changes that may need to be made that we just have not been able to do to this date.
So you started talking on the private capital there, and it's interesting. Obviously, you've spoken publicly about the role of private capital shaping resilience and readiness in the sort of current sort of geopolitical landscape in the past. As that's starting to evolve and adversaries are becoming more clear, and you're starting to see active conflicts in the world, whether that's Ukraine, Israel, or elsewhere. What are your views on private capital's role now? Has it shifted with some of these recent global developments? are there elements that we're not thinking about? I mean, whether that's everything from sort of at a very sort of defense level, sort of elements like threat finance, all the way through to how private capital operates with government, whether that's using effectively the due diligence machine of a fund to be more agile, working with, say, DoD or the IC community, or whether it's just simply how private capital integrates within the funding process. Like, how do you see that role shifting and moving forward?
I mean, I certainly see a greater need for it than ever before. Again, the pace of technology and the pace of innovation certainly is moving much faster than any government process to incorporate, new capabilities, new information. So that, I mean, that is that's probably the biggest challenge right now, is that, technology, and Teresa, you've talked about this forever, is that we are just advancing at such an incredible space out in the private sector, which is just so amazing. But government doesn't move that fast. And so that's where I think the role of private equity, private capital, plays a critical role. Again, it really gets to what can investment do to assure that systems are ready to be incorporated into the government architecture, that they meet standards, that they're safe, that they follow compliance, that all the bells and whistles are I's are dotted and T's are crossed, so the government can bring it in ready to go. And unless things change in the procurement acquisition process quickly, I think that, and I don't think it is, I mean, I think that's where private capital plays probably the most important role. And, going a little bit back to your first question, I'm just sitting here thinking, Teresa, what made my sort of trajectory a little different. And like you, we moved back and forth from government to private sector a number of times, which meant that you and I were much more willing to take on risk and to try new things, to actually bring in new capabilities, to look at new sort of funding strategies. And so I think in general, the government also needs to look to bring in more people like Teresa Smetzer, who can sort of help them get these capabilities as quickly as they can.
Yeah, just to elaborate on John's point, I love the idea of having private capital take on more of the responsibility, of course, not officially, but I mean informally, on due diligence to help ensure that technology, by the time it is mature enough, has already taken into consideration the things that today too often somebody will get really far down the path of a technology development and it's not remotely suitable or acceptable to the government environment. And so by having people that are from that world and who have the experience and the clearances and so on, are much better able to help shape that early on rather than wait until it's really painful and expensive to try to sort of shift a product development roadmap to accommodate what, whether it's the bureaucratic acquisition process or security or what is the business model and so on.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree 100%. And we've got examples of that where it's worked. So I think you look at something like the Defense Innovation Unit and Project Maven. I think that's a great example of, the private sector actually getting some funding to develop a capability. There was some sort of, there was this public-private relationship to actually help mold what needs to be done. What are the requirements? How is it going to work? It transitioned to OSD, and now it's at the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. And so, I mean, I think that wasn't a bad model. And so why can't we replicate that? And I think that is where we're going to have to go looking into the future.
Well, and to think about the policy issues that could present themselves with this new administration, we have hundreds of innovation units across the IC and DoD just in the U.S. And it's not that they're that they collaborate, but there's no easy way to align their efforts to get sort of the best outcomes. Imagine if you could, without becoming too bureaucratic and restructuring, imagine if you could align those into some common, easy way of sharing best practices and experiences and what's worked and what hasn't worked and so on. the power of that would be enormous. Now extend that across with our allies.
It's funny you should say. I'm just sitting here thinking, Teresa, you and I really started working more closely together when you were at the agency and I was at Nobles. And your vision was like creating these sort of small innovation hubs that worked very closely with the government, working together side by side, coming up with not only unique capabilities, but maybe unique ways of applying those insights to real world problems. And now we've just had this explosion of hubs. There's the Capital Factory in Austin, and I'm working with some folks in Boston that are creating innovation hubs. It's so exciting to see that the private sector really is really sees this problem, and this is where capitalism is great and coming up with solutions. But I love the idea of how do you then sort of how do you get those groups to work together, to leverage one another and add the allies to this is critically important. I can't say I have the answer for that, but I do think that's part of whatever the solution needs to be.
I mean, you're starting to see that with some of the hubs in the US, particularly drawing in AUKUS allies and others. I know that our own experience down in Austin has been like that, where we've seen Japanese companies come through and others and show their wares, so to speak. But I think part of the challenge has always been that you're typically dealing with programs and or products that are classified or under some form of security blanket, and so it's how you create that trusted source of knowledge, or more importantly, how you convey that information to the private sector without breaching that confidentiality. I'm sort of not teaching you to suck eggs here, but I think part of the role of private capital in this is not just on the due diligence side, but also having the ability to maybe cross the security cleared curtain, know what technologies are needed, know what isn't needed, because there's going to be stuff that government already has, we just don't know about it, and be able to relay that to the actual individual companies they're backing or choosing not to back on that basis. I think that's something a lot of funds don't have the ability to do. BOKA, we're lucky enough to have fairly good access to government, but I think there's certainly other funders out there that don't have that, and I think that would be invaluable to find a mechanism for people to be able to do that.
Yeah, and it's so funny. You're now my head is exploding because I'm just thinking. I tended to work. So there's 18 agencies in the intelligence community. I tended to work at the smaller ones: Coast Guard, State Department, INR. Even naval intelligence to a certain extent, not as big as some of the other agencies. And so you look at where funding is going and where innovation is going, and it tends to go to those places that already have money. But the reality is that there are a lot of other agencies that have a lot of other needs. And the reality is that how are we supporting those mission sets? You talk about threat financing as an example. Where companies are not necessarily incentivized to deliver capabilities to them because they don't have the same amount of money as CIA or the Special Forces world or NSA. And yet there's critical needs there. And so just thinking out loud, to the extent that some of these funds can be set up to provide support to some non-traditional areas that are getting more and more important and have great needs. That's certainly an area where the private sort of equity funding world could put some focus.
Well, and to add to that, Ellen, I couldn't agree more. I've always found the smaller organizations within the IC, like INR, as a much better incubator for trying new things, new business models, new technical approaches, new ways of engaging the private sector. Those are much better environments because they don't have the bureaucracy and the system that sort of makes it difficult. So how do you leverage those smaller organizations to do some of that testing? I mean, INR has always been the lead for 50 plus years in engaging academia and the think tanks on how to come up with the sort of latest thinking on what's happening in some regional security issue or some emergent issue that's a policy challenge.
I'm so glad you went there, Teresa, because it's, and INR is within the bigger State Department. So they're not as weighed down by culture, State Department is it's a large department, managed sort of like independent. It's managed with verticals. It doesn't always work well across. And so the thing that I'm really struck with and proud of with about State Department, though, is as we look at AI and some emerging technologies, I think State Department in some ways is a little further ahead than some of the other departments in the national security sector. Back during the last administration, they introduced this capability called the Center for Data Analytics, which really introduced to state advanced analytics and AI. And it's been surprising to watch how State Department has really leveraged some of these capabilities in ways that some of the other departments just haven't. So, to your viewers, State Department is a great place. If you've got cloud computing, advanced analytics, that's a great place to look. And as I look at my little INR, it's a great place to try out some of these new things, and they're more and more open to it than they were in the past. So,
and also to have state engage commerce, which has become a much bigger player in this world as we think about different rubrics for controlling and like ITAR. ITAR has been lifted for AUKUS countries, which is a huge policy step towards enabling more engagement, right? So what are other types of engagement where state could work with commerce and the rest of the IC to come up with different models to explore how to more aggressively leverage foreign investment? The other piece of that, which I see, which I'd love your view on, is sovereign wealth funds that are emerging as dominant forces globally in investing in technology. And so how does the US or AUKUS think about engaging sovereign wealth funds, which are really, they're looking at their own national security needs and where to invest and how to invest, but how does AUKUS engage those sovereign wealth funds to help guide that investment so that it supports Western goals and objectives as well?
Yeah, I've got to tell you, to be honest, I've not gotten my head around that one at all, but it does provide for another incredible option that we just didn't have a few years ago. So, I'd love to, again, I don't know, I'm going to ask you, on the sovereign wealth fund side, have we seen any leveraging of that with Ukraine? Has that been a source of funding for operations in Ukraine right now, where the private sector is very quickly incorporating capabilities to Ukraine?
Yeah.
I don't know the answer. You should be asking me the question now.
Well, I'll let John talk about that because we have a recent hire that's quite involved in that.
Okay. Sorry.
Yeah, look, the short answer is no at face value. I think that there are undoubtedly technologies being deployed in Ukraine, most of which that aren't being spoken about, that will certainly have some sovereign backing to them. And by that, I mean sovereign wealth backing as opposed to national backing, but no explicit financing, to my knowledge. I think typically what you've seen, and to coin the phrase, you've got these economic levers of power, as they call them, and I think typically what you've seen to date has been sovereign wealth used more for its soft influence geopolitically, and particularly around sort of basic diplomacy as well. And that might be buying property in a country, or it might be investing in a country's industry, or whatever it might be. But yeah, to date, I think in short, you haven't seen a lot of it at a sort of individual technology level. But I do agree with Teresa that there is plenty of room for countries to start using those slightly more innovative vehicles to gain influence.
So again, going back to State Department, this is where I know I was so shocked when I went to INR and I found that part of what INR was doing was, of course, supporting diplomatic efforts overseas, which actually included, promoting business, promoting investment, promoting soft power. Had never really done that before from an intelligence perspective, but certainly we were definitely playing in that role. And it was amazing to see, even during the last administration, how that became a much bigger mission area, to provide support to diplomatic efforts to encourage investment.
Well, you're sort of seeing that. I've talked more from an allied perspective, but obviously at an adversarial perspective, there is much more use of those sorts of levers. So, and that ranges everything from IP theft through to financing or providing bridge finance to technology companies and essentially trying to take control of IP through the back door. I mean, there's different ways that people are using money now, and to a certain extent, I think the allies, US and allies, are sort of catching up in a lot of, we're playing catch up with the likes of China and other countries that are using these levers much more proactively than we are.
Which gets to the need to have almost a common operational picture upon which everybody plays in. We certainly do that on the Intel side, but expanding it to this sector would be very helpful.
Well, and I think also having the data analytics to be able to detect pretty quickly when something's working really well or something seemed like a good idea but turned out maybe not so, and adjusting accordingly. It's that agility that's really hard for big governments, but industry is much more adept at that. So how do you leverage that, right?
Again, I think this is where public-private partnerships, again, until we can make some big policy changes in the government, which I just don't see happening, the role of public-private partnerships is just going to get bigger and bigger and bigger to ensure that government actually can pull in those capabilities, pull in that knowledge, and not have to take on all the risks.
Let's look at the Russia-Ukraine situation for a minute, because I think it's a great theater to think about just how different warfare and engagement has actually evolved. It's an incubator in many ways to experience what we're talking about. And so I think the scrappiness of the Ukrainians in terms of developing their own drone capabilities, for example, has been written about extensively, but that's only one example. And so how do we see the allies' role, but also emergent tech role in enabling Western interests where it makes sense? And how do we learn from that and fold that back into how we think about deployment of private capital?
Yeah, I mean, I think Ukraine has been, as sad as it is and how angry I get because of it, it's also been an incredible opportunity to really learn and better understand how we can have more impact sort of in this modern world. Having worked at NGA, to see the role of commercial imagery, for example, has just been so exciting. It's not classified systems. We can gain situational awareness openly. You and I can gain situational awareness about what's going on in Ukraine and also in Israel with Hamas as well, but mostly with Ukraine. And so that's really exciting. I think on the cyber side, Russia and other countries are very good at targeting Ukraine. And so what we're learning from that and how we can help, stifle cyber attacks with private investment, we're really gaining greater understanding. And I also think, the need to be very transparent with our allies and be much more open about what we're seeing and what's going on, and the value of that, more so than I think in any other conflict that we've ever really experienced, and certainly in my lifetime. And again, going back to the cyber side, I would add on information warfare, because that's actually the area that I'm running a company called Trust in Media right now. But I think, how real-time data can impact people's public perceptions of what's going on, and then what we can do to actually counter propaganda or counter misinformation. So, there's just so many lessons we're gaining from all of this, and so many success stories also. It kind of gets back to the private sector funding that's actually helped introduce capabilities very quickly using drones. I'm on the board of a company that does counter drones, and they've been very engaged in terms of Ukraine and getting capabilities in, and involved in R&D relationships there. So sad story, but incredible opportunity to really see how our technology works, see how investment is working, and make changes as appropriate.
You could argue now more than ever, you're seeing this sort of the impact of both data and cyber in one respect, but when you take it to sort of its civilian extension around social media use, effectively psyops that are being deployed by other nation states, using channels that we all use on a daily basis, you can see how influence is being sort of manipulated in a whole new way that really we've not encountered on the same scale in the past. I mean, traditional propaganda has always had a place in conflict, but I think it seems to me now, at least, that through social media, that propaganda machine has gone to the next level.
Yeah, I mean, yes. Again, this tends to be the area that I'm particularly passionate about, and the timing is very interesting. We've got the Global Engagement Center at the State Department right now, which is facing the potential of not being funded. I mean, effective this weekend. I know that there's some Senator Cornyn or others are madly working to try and secure funding for that kind of a capability at a time when I think we need it more than ever, and so So this is where the private sector can actually play an incredible role in providing tools and capabilities that maybe the government would, but just isn't right now to assist in the malign influence side of the house.
So let's talk very briefly about sort of what we're missing at this point. What are some of the critical gaps or underexplored adversarial threats in particular that you feel deserve more focus in policy and or investment? And whether there are I'll just carry on, whether there are emerging technologies that maybe could offer some promising solutions to those.
So sort of feeding on your last question, I mean, I think I would go information operations from my perspective is really huge. In the weaponization of AI. Although, I'm learning more and more as I become, with my own company, smarter on AI, that AI can be an incredible tool to actually assist in this regard. In fact, I'm finding more and more that it's actually really cool in terms of the capabilities and what it can do to fight mis and disinformation and to enhance information quality. But that said, we have to be aware of how AI can be weaponized with deep fakes and all of that, and just be prepared to take that on. Another area, going back to my Navy days, that I'm really interested in right now, and I think we need much more focus, is sort of the undersea world, undersea cables. It's who has the lead on ensuring the protection of undersea cables. And, they carry the majority of global internet traffic. And yet, who's got the lead? Who has that area of responsibility? That's one that actually kind of keeps me awake at night. And so, I think the government really needs to get its arms around we've got a Space Force who's taking care of the other domain. And then what can we do to ensure the protection of those systems? And then, of course, again, going back to my NGA days, we just had a satellite. Boeing just had a satellite that blew up. And it just gets me thinking about space infrastructure and vulnerabilities. I know Space Force is there, but, as we've got more and more things, more and more commercial capabilities, national capabilities, allied capabilities floating around in space, I think we definitely need more investment in space resilience. And I mean, so those for me are the big three where I'd love to see more investment. I know there are capabilities that are being designed. I know that innovation is hot on this, but I'd love to see more focus on these.
Just to elaborate on that, I think the good news is the investment in space right now is just stunning, and it's hard to even keep track of some of the emergent capabilities that are going to change the game in space. And I think that's certainly a big area where BOKA is focused. But I think across the board, you're seeing some things emerge that the government couldn't possibly have written requirements to develop or deliver those things because they didn't know they could happen. And so then the question is, how do you leverage those capabilities to inform a new way of thinking about space resilience, for example? Same with undersea. There's two companies I'm talking to that are just stunning. I mean, it totally disrupts our thinking about how do we understand and sense early on what's happening in the seas, where you can't just, it's like the Elon Musk video, if you've seen it, where he was asked early on in SpaceLink to demonstrate that he wasn't going to kill sharks or kill seals. And it's just if it wasn't true, it would be hysterical. But the whole process he had to go through to demonstrate that statistically it was virtually impossible, given how big the ocean is and how the population. So it's that sort of, how do you overcome that? So A, yes, it's the investment in those areas, but B, it's how does the West think about different modes of operating as a result of those capabilities that may completely disrupt their thinking. And as you know, Ellen, that's always been my passion is how do you now, so new administration, always an opportunity for new thinking.
New day. Yeah, it's funny, Teresa. The one benefit of Space Force being new is it's young, and so again, it's not weighed down by this old culture, old way of thinking, old way of doing business. And so I just know in my interactions with Space Force, it's kind of exciting because you seem to be connecting with folks who are willing to think new things and do new things, and so that gives me some hope. Regarding the seabed stuff, though, I'm glad to hear you're working with companies that are looking at this and providing incredible capabilities. But who are they talking to? Who really has oversight of this domain? Is it the Navy? Is it the Department of Homeland Security? Like, who's asking these questions? And
well, that's right, and it's everybody and nobody, because there are a lot of departments that have some need to be part of the conversation, but who really is orchestrating? I mean, the two companies I'm thinking of are both very early stage, but very promising results to date. And so, they asked the question, well, who do I go to in the federal government to help inform so that what we do is on track with what they need? And, it's a difficult question to answer today.
And we didn't really talk about this as much, but it really is where sort of this private investment, can really play a bigger role in shaping policy. So getting somebody like BOKA to start working the Hill and articulating why this is important, to be a voice for these areas where, government can't or just doesn't right now articulate what we need and what's going on.
I'm sure you've seen it. There's a lot of discussion in the last couple of years. Japan has now decided, it made some pretty strategic, sort of discussions around this idea of joining AUKUS and getting into their own defense. South Korea obviously always has, but has taken on a new level of urgency for them. So the idea of extending AUKUS to Japan and South Korea in particular seems to be more and more under discussion. So it is exciting, but how do you think about, from your time at state, extending that rubric to them? And it sort of, on one hand, makes it a little more complicated. On the other hand, it's that much more opportunity to provide for defense.
It's so interesting, Teresa. When I was in graduate school, I was studying Japan and how it spent less than 1% of its GDP on defense, and here they are right now, expanding to, I don't know, what is it, 6%? It's they're all in, which is an incredible opportunity now to help sort of shape capabilities and how exactly we play with Japan in terms of dealing with the other side of the world. I think it's very exciting, by the way. And bringing South Korea in. So you take these, for the most part, our alliances have always been very Western focused. And by adding Japan and South Korea, and augmenting Australia, we're really now gaining insights and understanding that we never would never have had before, in terms of not only intelligence, but, information sharing on research and development and capabilities and where we can work together. And it's all new. And so, I'm very excited by the prospects of this. Where state can play a role, State Department, is to really to take advantage of this new momentum of the willingness of South Korea and Japan to work more closely with us as allies, share information, set up different relationships, different public-private models, different sort of diplomatic policies that encourage investment and encourage information sharing. I hope State Department is doing that right now. I imagine they are. They have created a bureau that focuses on emerging technologies and cyber. Some might argue it's a little late to the game, but it's here now. And so I would imagine that particular bureau is really front and center in terms of, managing these relationships and ensuring better information sharing.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Ellen. Any Any thoughts you have based on our conversation that we should be thinking about beyond what we've already discussed?
No, I've got to tell you, I really appreciate the opportunity to have had this discussion and to really think about, again, the role that the private sector plays in ensuring that, going into the future, we as a government continue to have cutting edge technologies, and we continue to be the most innovative, us and our allies. And so, I do appreciate the chance to think about things differently. And it is a new day. We just had an election, so it's funny, some of the questions that you had thrown me, I have different answers for today. So because it is going to be a new focus, and that's exciting. So glad you all are here to help us navigate the newness.
We'll see where it all goes, but I agree. It is exciting. The future is always exciting. So,
yeah.
Appreciate it. Thank you so much, Ellen. That was really
Thank you.
really interesting conversation. Thank you.